Welcome to our webinar on best practice using the NEC suite of contracts. This webinar aims to provide a detailed overview of NEC contracts, to look at and discuss common issues experienced with these contracts, and to provide some tips on how to deal with or avoid those issues. We will also draw on our experience providing this training to clients to try to discuss some aspects and answer some questions which have come out of those client training sessions. So this webinar is focused on helping contract operators make the best use of the NEC contract, and particularly for contractors and subcontractors. This webinar is going to have a couple of pause points in it where some case study questions can be considered. So if you are listening in a group, we would recommend that these questions are considered and discussed in your group in that period. This webinar will be just over an hour long, but you could take between an hour and 2 hours if some time is taken for those discussion workshops whilst the webinar is paused. Now, as this is a pre-recorded webinar, we don't have a chat function available, which our live webinars usually have. However, if you have any questions which you would like to ask the team, please feel free to give us a call or drop us an email, and we will aim to get back to you as soon as possible. So I am Nathaniel Buckingham, an associate in the commercial disputes team at Shepherd and Wedderburn, specialising in construction and engineering disputes based in Edinburgh. Prior to joining Shepherd and Wedderburn in 2013, I was a chartered civil engineer working for AECOM in Edinburgh, designing the engineering aspects of a variety of industrial, hospital, school and commercial buildings. I'm joined today by Lisa Ambrose, a solicitor in our team, also specialising in construction disputes. Now, we both regularly advise clients on a range of projects and claims, which often require strategic and commercial thinking. As a dispute specialists, we have an up-to-date understanding of the legislative, court and industrial context, and also have a strong commercial focus. We advise clients on the various standard form construction contracts on a regular basis, including the NEC contracts, JCT and FIDIC. And our clients include local authorities and universities, employers, building contractors and facilities managers, which means that we have usually seen a dispute from many different angles before. Now, this experience forms part of our advice and what we will share with you today. Now, as I noted a minute ago, do feel free to contact either of us to discuss this webinar topic or any other construction dispute matter you may have. And I'll now pass you on to Lisa, who's going to run through the agenda for this webinar.
Thanks, Nathaniel. We will start with an introduction to the NEC suite of contracts, including the background behind their introduction, their underlying philosophy, and their main features. We will be focusing on the NEC3 engineering and construction contract, options A and C, as these are the standard form contracts which are most commonly in use. We are not focusing on any particular version of NEC3, as there are the 2005, 2011 and 2013 versions in circulation, as many of the points that we will make apply to each of the different versions of the NEC contracts. Also, much of what we will be saying will be equally relevant to the newer NEC4 suite of contracts released in 2017 and gaining popularity, particularly with public bodies. We will then turn to payments and final account, and we will discuss the different payment mechanisms under each of the options, as well as common issues with each of these. Next, we will cover programs and, in particular, the importance of having an up-to-date one. We will then move on to discuss early warnings and notifications and their part to play in NEC contracts, before finally looking at compensation events in detail. We will then end this session with a summary of the key points to take away from this webinar. As Nathaniel noted, we've got 2 workshop pause points after the programs section and after the early warnings and compensation events sections, where these issues can be thought about, and if you are listening to this as a group, discuss to hopefully gain a better understanding of these aspects and their use. So we are hoping to take your knowledge of NEC contracts slightly further today by looking at how they are structured, why they are drafted the way they are, how they operate, and what the key areas are for commercial contract operators on the ground to be aware of. This is why we're going to focus on payments, programme and compensation events, which are some of the main aspects used on a day-to-day basis. We will try and focus on some of the positives of NEC contracts. There are clearly benefits in following the contract properly, which help contractors to maximise their entitlements under the contract, which is the purpose here. In more traditional contracts, it is easier to bump issues to the end, make claims, and perhaps get a financially acceptable result later on. With NEC, it is trickier to do that, and easier for a contractor to find themselves inadequately compensated for what they've done on the contract. That is simply the way that NEC's contracts are set up, and as a result of how it is supposed to operate.
So this session is intended to consolidate and reinforce the best practice use of NEC contracts for those who have some experience using this suite of contracts. If you've got no experience of these contracts, we would recommend perhaps that before proceeding with this webinar, you listen to some of our Introduction to NEC Contracts webinars, which can be found on our YouTube and Vimeo sites, as shown on the screen. Although we will do a brief recap of the NEC contracts at the beginning here too. We'll also recommend that you do look at our YouTube and Vimeo site and also our Knowledge and Articles site, both websites of which are on the screen now, as we have a lot of interesting and useful webinars and articles freely available covering a whole range of topics. Now, we often see projects using NEC contracts where there are issues and things that have gone wrong. Often that is because the contract has not been operated as it should be. And for example, that might mean that the contractor has lost an entitlement to compensation events which they may otherwise have been able to claim. We have also seen situations where there has been disruption to the works and parallel acceleration to try to recover time, and retrospectively it can become very difficult to unpick that and decide what the contractor is entitled to. Before we look at the NEC contracts in detail, there are just one or two more general good practice points to make. First of all, we would encourage all contract operators to look at, read, know, and understand the contract you are working with. It is not unusual for NEC contracts to be amended, and it is important that the contract operator, the person using the contract day to day, actually knows about those amendments and how they may affect the works or the operation of the contract during the project. Also, we would recommend good record keeping and project management, where they're both really essential. It may sometimes be necessary to look back at emails, notices, project minutes, etc., in order to consider how the contract was operated, so having good records puts you in a really good position if that sort of forensic analysis and look back is required. For example, if you don't keep a good record of early warning notices that have been given, it may be difficult to prove later that risks were warned about, and there might be a financial consequence of that. As we mentioned a minute ago, we are going to focus quite heavily on activity schedules and options A and C. We will discuss how the activity schedule is operated in terms of making sure it is not forgotten about, and also the pain-gain scenario and how that operates in option C. It is just as important with a cost-reimbursable contract to have sight of that final account and how you are operating and how you are adjusting the contract price throughout the life of the project, such that you do not come up against difficulties in the end if either the contractor or the employer have not been kept up to date with that cost. Although I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with it, Lisa is now going to just run through the NEC contract.
So in terms of the NEC suite of contracts generally, they are deliberately quite different from traditional forms of contract and have a particular style and language. They are supposed to be a bit more straightforward and more of a project management tool than just a legal document to allocate risk and responsibility between the parties. This means that sometimes legal precision is subordinated to a proactive, modern management process. Comparing NEC with other standard forms, it is aimed more at cooperation rather than conflict and early identification and resolution of problems, so it is quite an onerous contract in terms of administration. But the point is that there is an open flow of communication between the parties all the way through the contract, and things are adjusted as they go instead of everything being dealt with at the end. They are intended to be applied in a common sense way and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, which is always at clause 10.1 and is the principle that should underpin the whole contract. NEC is not as precise or tested as ICE or the JCT forms of contract. There are various options which provide for different ways of pricing the contracts and different ways of dealing with payments. Option A, the option that we are going to concentrate on today, is a priced contract with an activity schedule. Option B is the priced contract with a bill of quantities. Option C is a target contract with an activity schedule. And then option D is a target contract with a bill of quantities. We have then got options E and F. Option E is a cost reimbursable contract, and option F is a management contract. For options A and C, the contract is priced according to an activity schedule, and that is essentially what describes the works and activities a contractor has to perform throughout the contract. It is supposed to be in enough detail to allow the contractor to price the work. It might be quite prescriptive, but it can also allow the contractor a considerable amount of freedom compared with a traditional bill of quantities, where the contractor has to price each element of work and is quite specific. To give an extremely simplified example, if an activity schedule requires the contractor to build a wall with given dimensions or characteristics, the contractor might be able to build that wall using a few different materials or techniques, whereas in a bill of quantities, typically it will tell the contractor the exact materials, equipment and techniques that they need to use to build the wall. Under option A, the contractor prices the activities on the activity schedule at tender stage, and they submit both the activity schedule and a total of the prices. It cannot simply be expanded after the tender stage to create better cash flow, as it is only supposed to be changed in accordance with the contract, so with the agreement of the project manager or as a result of a compensation event. Option A is supposed to be quite a low administration contract, and payments should be straightforward for each activity. The administration of compensation events under option A is the same as the other contracts, as compensation events can vary the activity schedule, which then has an immediate and direct impact on monthly payments. Under option C, the activity schedule is also submitted at tender stage. However, the contractor is paid on defined cost plus fee. The purpose of the activity schedule in option A is to calculate monthly payments to the contractor, whereas in option C, the activity schedule is used to calculate the contractor's pain or gain share at the end of the project. Under both of these options, the activity schedule has to be updated and submitted for acceptance if the contractor has changed a planned method of working, so that the activities on the activity schedule no longer relate to the operations on the accepted programme. We will come on to discuss this a bit later on. There is more administration at tender stage to get the activity schedule right. It is also essential that a contractor or subcontractor develops an accurate tender programme in tandem with the activity schedule. However, in theory, there should then be less planning and administration once the work commences, compared with the bill of quantities contract. Activity schedules should also include activities such as design tasks, providing equipment, and temporary works. Activities and groups of activities should be readily identifiable and not too controversial, and the activity schedule is not works information. It is a pricing document only. The works information is held separately. There are a couple of requirements which need to be met for any NEC contract to run smoothly, particularly option A. Firstly, the contract should be fair to all parties and allow any contractor to make a fair profit if the contract has been correctly priced and planned. Parties should ensure that the works information is complete and of the highest quality to try to avoid costly compensation events throughout the project. All parties should understand the contract fully and how it's administered. The programme has to be constantly updated. There should be clear and frequent communication between the parties. The contractor should keep clear daily records. There should be a good and timely or contemporaneous operation of the contract. So, for example, assessment of compensation events should be done as and when they arise. And finally, the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation between the parties has to underpin the whole contract. These requirements are not always met, and running NEC contracts can cause difficulties. For example, the role of the project manager in NEC contracts is extremely important, and if the project manager is not acting independently, as he or she should under the contract, then disputes can arise and quickly unravel the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. It is good to consider the type of NEC operator that the project manager is likely to be at the outset of the contract. Public sector organisations tend to be a bit better at getting to grips with how NEC ought to be used, as they have had a lot of training and background in NEC, and the general public sector procurement approach is geared much more around partnership and mutual trust. Some private sector operators and larger employers can use it and can use it well, but others clearly cannot. Please do note that this training is on NEC unamended contracts. Clauses such as 10.1 are rarely cut out, but some amendments to NEC contracts can cut entirely across the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, rendering the clause meaningless. We are going to try and pick up on clauses in NEC contracts where you need to be aware of amendments, because it is all well and good knowing how the contract ought to work and what the base contract looks like, but contract operators also need to know what to look out for in an amended contract to see what changes have been made and whether these changes are palatable or require different actions during the project. There are areas where, in our experience, we see heavy amendments which you ought to be aware of because they can change the shape of the contract. Depending on your role, some contract operators should consider these in the context of whether or not they are acceptable at the outset of the contract, whereas others need to consider where to look for these amendments and know what amendments are key, and then to think if these amendments mean that you need to change the way you usually operate this type of contract.
So we'll now discuss payment under the NEC contract. As Lisa briefly mentioned, monthly payments under the different options are very different. So in option A, you're paid for the activity schedule prices for completed activities or groups of activities. In option B, you're paid for the quantities of completed work, remeasured essentially at bill of quantity rates and proportion of lump sums. For option C, you're paid your defined cost of work done plus a fee, so the monthly payments are not linked at all to the activity schedule. That only comes into play at the end. Under option D, you're also paid defined cost of work done plus fee, and so again, that's not linked to the bill of quantities at all either, month to month until the end. Now, defined cost is separate to the activity schedule and bill of quantities and is used as a mechanism which is slightly different across each option for working out payment aspect. So for option A, defined cost is only used for the assessment of compensation events and uses the shorter schedule of cost components and contract part 2 data. A compensation event is assessed as the effect of the compensation event upon the actual defined cost of the work already done and the forecast defined cost of the work not done, plus any resulting fee. So, a change in the works information requiring some additional future work to be done would have that future work priced using the shorter schedule of cost components and the resulting fee, which would be added to the activity schedule as a new activity or with another activity or group. Compensation events that have an impact on work already done are more complicated to calculate. Shorter schedule is used for simplicity of calculating compensation events, but we must remember that the cost of preparing quotations is not paid because that's deemed to be included in the fee in option A. In option B, changed lump sums in the bill of quantities. Rates used in the bill of quantities can only be used for assessment of compensation events in option B if the contractor and project manager agrees. That's what clause 63.13 says. This means that the contractor does not benefit or lose out on a good or bad rate in their contract as a result of a compensation event, but that they must have accurate contract Part 2 data, otherwise bill of quantity or other industry rates might be used to assess the compensation event. It is important to remember that compensation events and remeasurement are completely different aspects and can be treated differently depending on the option being used. Options C and D use defined costs for calculating monthly payments and for the assessment of compensation events. Both use the schedule of cost components, that's the longer version, which is a more detailed schedule requiring more data in the contract data part 2, and that's just simply to reflect the more complicated payment approach in those two contracts. In option C, it is helpful to include the target value in monthly forecasts so that the client or the employer has sight of where the pay and gain share is sitting each month, and each party can manage things more easily at an early stage rather than perhaps getting a surprise at the end of the project. In all the options, the Contract Data Part 2 section of the contract requires information to be added at the start of the project on percentage of people overheads, published lists of equipment, rates for equipment, design rates, design overheads, etc. It is therefore important that the data for the shorter and the main schedule of cost components in Contract Data Part 2 is considered and completed accurately, as it forms the basis of financial compensation for compensation events. Now, this is often overlooked, and often Contract Data Part 2 is inadequately completed. Now, we understand that this is because parties can often prefer just to meet up and agree the value of compensation events as they go along. Now, that's all well and good when everything's going well. However, it can cause some trouble if agreement is not possible, if the fallback option of using the shorter and schedule of cost components data isn't there or hasn't been completed. Now, options A and C are not remeasurable contracts, so the measurement and the costing of the activity is at the contractor's risk, although you have got compensation events for variations and changes. On the other hand, options D and E are remeasurable, so the majority of risk sits with the employer, obviously subject to amendment that can change. This is not a particularly well understood general principle amongst employers, so you may have contractors who think they can remeasure an activity schedule, or employers who think they have got a fixed price with a bill of quantity, option B, and it's those sorts of misunderstandings that can sometimes be the root cause of disputes. Now, we would suggest that if you are working with an existing and established client that you know are familiar with these contracts and how to operate them, then generally you'll have quite a lot of confidence that things should operate well. However, if not, it's not a bad thing for a contractor to be making an employer aware of how the contract operates at the beginning of the contract, even the simplicity as to whether things are remeasurable or not. It's much better for a contractor to flag those sorts of aspects at the start, so that an employer is aware of that, and the contractors will likely be held as being much more trustworthy in the employer's eyes right from the beginning, and particularly later if a remeasurement is done, for example, if that's been flagged at the beginning. This, of course, also goes some way towards the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, which should underpin the contract. One idea that we have discussed regularly with clients is the idea of holding a meeting or workshop at the start of a project where each party talks through the contract option and process to be followed under the contract. Who should do what and when, how to deal with a dispute if one arises. This can ensure that both parties are really on the same page at the outset as to how the contract is to be managed on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. And it can open a line of communication between parties early on, which might be helpful in preventing disputes from escalating to adjudication, and can make sure that key principles are followed throughout the operation of the contract. Also, we would recommend that you try to give the schedule of cost components high priority or consideration at the start of the contract, so that if compensation events do arise, they can be dealt with efficiently and without issue because you've got the data there that you need to assess them. If you've got a good schedule of cost components and the data has been put there up front, you can use it for your defined costs and try to resist the temptation to just make a deal on a price, but actually to calculate it properly. This gives the contract more certainty and allows less scope for a dispute. There are, of course, situations where an element of pragmatism is required, and in some contracts, agreements can be reached on most issues as the contract runs along. However, having a good schedule of cost components at the outset gives you a really good basis for negotiations and provides a fallback position if agreement cannot be reached. So for all four options, the importance of defined costs input is clear, and it's even more important in options C and D. I want to just briefly recap as to the main difference between option A and C, which are both based on the activity schedule and how payments are made. So just as a reminder then, in option A, the contractor is paid monthly for the completed activities on the activity schedule, less any amounts to be retained. Compensation events then adjust the activity schedule as the project goes along, and that will then be reflected in what is paid in those monthly payments. In option C, though, the contractor is actually paid their defined cost forecast. So, in other words, he's paid his actual costs and not paid relative to the activity schedule. The activity schedule is still adjusted for compensation events and should be adjusted as the project goes along, but its only relevance is for the pay and gain mechanism to be operated at the end of the project. But as we mentioned earlier, we always recommend that the adjusted activity schedule is shared between parties regularly so that both parties know how the project is turning out financially. So we'll now take a look at the programme requirements of the NEC contract, after which we'll have our first pause for a workshop.
The programme, or lack thereof, is another common issue in NEC contracts. Firstly, it should be noted that there is a difference in the programme between the contractor's contract starting date and the contractor's access date. There might be quite a lot of activities that are required before the physical works start on site. You cannot start work until the access date, but that could be some time after the starting date. The start date in the contract triggers a lot of obligations and liabilities under the contract, and it commences with the obligation to submit revised programmes at the intervals stated in the contract data. The programme to be followed is the agreed tender programme, if that's been submitted, and then after that there should be revised programmes that are submitted throughout the contract if that is required. Revised programmes should be submitted within the period for reply as set out in the contract, and these can either be after being instructed to submit a revised programme, when the contractor chooses, and in any case it should not be at a longer interval than has been stated in the contract data. If the contractor fails to submit an initial programme, clause 50.3 requires a 25% retainer on payments to the contractor for work done until there is a programme in place. And it is not very clear whether this requirement falls away once a first programme has been submitted for acceptance by the contractor, or if this only falls away once actually accepted by the employer. This should therefore be avoided if possible. This programme and all subsequent programmes need to be quite sophisticated, as clause 31.2 sets out a specific and detailed list of the items that have to be included in it. These include the start date, access dates and planned completion, the order and timing of the operations of the contractor and employer, details of the resources and equipment to be used for each operation, dates by which the contractor will require access or specific information, for example design information, and provisions for float and time risk allowances. For the activity schedule options, there also needs to be quite a good link between the programme and the activity schedule. The reason for that is that it then ought to make it fairly non-controversial when you have achieved each activity within the activity schedule. You are able to revise your programme whenever you choose to. That does not lead on to a change to the activity schedule unless agreed, but when operating NEC you should definitely get into the habit of updating the programme every time there is a change. You should never try to manipulate your programme, it should just be accurate, including things like when you require access, when you require specific information, and when you require another party to do something, makes it easier to demonstrate the impact of any compensation events should they arise. This is an obvious point, but sometimes the focus on programmes can be on your own activities without considering other influences on your work.
So the fact that the accepted programme shows the float and time risk allowances is really quite interesting under NEC, because the delay and impact of compensation events is measured by reference to planned key dates and planned completion dates shown on the accepted programme. This is distinct from some other forms of standard form contract and means that the contractor owns critical path float, what we refer to as time risk allowances. If the contractor has built time risk allowances into their programme and a float, i.e. a float for particular activities, and a compensation event has an impact on the critical path, then they do not lose the float. So we prefer to use the term time risk allowances for contractor-owned floats rather than float more generally, because the float that exists out with the critical path does not belong to the contractor. So if you have a compensation event that impacts non-critical path items, i.e. you can accommodate it because it is not on the critical path, and does not impact the completion date, then that float really is to the employer's benefit. However, where you have critical path time risk allowances which would affect the completion date, then the contractor essentially owns the float. If the critical path changes, then whatever float is built into the critical path as it exists at any given time is the contractor's. So, for example, if a compensation event results in the critical path changing and also results in that new critical path going past the completion date, you would get the benefit of that from a time perspective. If a non-critical path item has float or time risk allowances built within it, and a compensation event means that it then becomes critical path, then again the contractor owns those time risk allowances. So, for example, if you have got two competing streams of work, one which is critical path to complete on a completion date, the other that is non-critical path with a 2-week contract float rather than a time risk allowance at the end, if there is a variation or compensation event or added work to the second stream that makes it 2 weeks longer, there would be no time benefit to the contractor for that, because the contractor can still complete by the completion date. The only exception to that is if that non-critical stream has its own key date, then it is an impact on the key date or completion date that can give you a time allowance.
If the programme is included within the contract data, then it is automatically the accepted programme. If the programme is submitted afterwards, or for any revisals to the programme, it only becomes the accepted programme after being accepted by the contractor, or the employer, sorry. The contractor has 2 weeks to accept a submitted programme or notify the contractor of his reasons for not accepting it. Clause 31.3 sets out 4 reasons for the employer not accepting the programme, which include the plans are not practicable, it does not show the information that the contract requires, i.e. has insufficient detail, it's not a realistic reflection of the contractor's plans, or it does not comply with the works information. These are relatively subjective, so the employer has some power here. If revising the programme, the contractor should show actual progress achieved on each operation and effective timing of remaining work, the effects of implemented compensation events, how it plans to deal with any delays or correct any defects, and any other changes the contractor proposes to make. The contract is silent on what happens if a programme is rejected. By default, the previously accepted programme will continue to be the contract programme, but if there was no programme in the contract data and the employer does not accept the first programme, then there is an important contractual mechanism absent. There is nothing to stop work starting without a programme, but there are some knock-on implications. If the project manager does not accept a programme for any other reason than listed, i.e. it's not practicable, it doesn't show the information required, it doesn't represent plans, or does not comply with the works information, that is a compensation event under clause 60.16 or 0.9. The programme cannot be rejected simply because completion is shown as later than the completion date. There is no easy way of forcing a project manager to accept a programme, and compensation events are complicated. It is therefore key to maintain good working relationships and to have discussions about reasons for rejecting programmes, as it is important to get an accepted programme in place. It should be noted that building float into a programme is not a reason for the project manager to reject the programme. That is not to say that the contractor would not be under commercial pressure to remove the float. However, you are entitled to resubmit the programme on the basis that a rejection is not valid.
And as we're saying there, you can get into quite a grey area where there is no accepted programme and the contractor is submitting compensation events which are then also being rejected. The time impact on the compensation event is assessed against the accepted programme, so if there's no updated accepted programme, even because the project manager is rejecting them, and even if that has been rejected for what might seem spurious reasons, the correct approach to any compensation event is to go back to the previously accepted programme. However, you should remember that the project manager rejecting programmes erroneously is itself a compensation event, and this can be used if discussions break down. So we'd recommend contractors not to be put off by continuing to submit programs and keep them up to date for two reasons. Firstly, if the contractor does escalate this sort of dispute to adjudication, then that would be the basis upon which they are going to assess the impact of those rejections. And secondly, if a contractor is then looking at the impact in terms of what the contractor has missed out on for compensation events because the program has not been accepted and because there's not an updated accepted program, if you were to take that sort of dispute to adjudication, then you would be able to ask the adjudicator, firstly, what the accepted program should be, and point to all the programs to see which one should have been accepted and when. And if your program or programs should have been accepted, then the second question to put to the adjudicator would be, secondly, what is the impact on all of these other compensation events that have been wrongly assessed because there was an inadequate or old accepted program? Now, of course, this can be a very messy area to unpick, and it's particularly difficult to progress this sort of claim if a contractor has not regularly submitted programs which accurately record progress at the time. Obviously, before going down this route, it's clearly very helpful to flag to a project manager that they have rejected a program for invalid reasons, and that as a consequence, as a contractor, you're entitled to apply for a compensation event. That in itself might be enough to persuade a project manager to consider the program again, or at least to open up a discussion about how to adjust the program without immediately escalating to something like adjudication. However, in our experience, really, adjudication shouldn't be feared or avoided. NEC envisages that if there is, for example, an impasse on the program, or really any other aspect, that you should have a short, simple adjudication on that question, so that, for example, with a program, an accepted program can be put in place by an adjudicator. Both parties then can put forward the case, and the adjudicator will reach an answer which will allow both parties to move on with the contract. Now, we're aware from our experience that often adjudication is seen as a bit of a dirty word, it's grown into something that it perhaps shouldn't be, grown into some bigger disputes. But it can be used to quickly cut through an impasse and allow parties to continue working together, particularly on larger projects. So, we'd encourage you, rather than seeing adjudication as a nuclear option on some projects, it might just be the next necessary step. So that the parties, can understand what their position is, and that might be the next necessary step if, for example, a contractor is continually having the program rejected. Now, the biggest issue that we see with programs and time when it comes to compensation events is the intertwining of different delay events. So, the more frequently you can update your program and the more accurate it is, even if it has been rejected, then the more likely you are able to pinpoint a particular compensation event, because month by month you, as a contractor, have recorded any of your own delays or shown faster progress, and then you're going to be measuring your compensation events against that actual progress. On the other hand, if a contractor has no program, then it's very likely there'll be no compensation for time, or if you have got an out-of-date program, you will have an out-of-date compensation event for time as well. It's all too easy, of course, for us as lawyers to say, simply keep your programs up to date. But it is worth, perhaps after this session in individual groups or as a business, to just think about if one of the reasons you are perhaps losing time compensation events is as a result of any of these factors. How can you address those factors? How do you as contractors ensure that you have enough resources perhaps to keep your programs up to date? And that can make a big difference when it comes to compensation events. There are a few examples of compensation events which we will look at in a bit more detail later on, which rely heavily on an accepted program being in place. Clause 60.1.2 allows a compensation event if access to and use of a part of the site by the later of its access date and the date shown on the accepted program is not given. So clearly it's important to have an up-to-date accepted program that shows when a contractor needs to have that access. Clause 60.15, if the employer and others, such as the employer's team, are to work within the time shown on the accepted program, and there's a compensation event if they don't, So again, an out-of-date program may justify information being supplied late by the employer's team if you've not told, if the program doesn't say when it needs to be done by, if they, for example, were not aware of changed deadlines. More generally, if a compensation event would impact on the completion date, as the completion date can be adjusted for compensation events, but the accepted program and completion date is out of date, then the contractor will lose out on the adjustment to the completion date, which they may otherwise have been due. Clause 64.2 gives the project manager a free hand when assessing compensation events if there is either no accepted program or if the contractor has not been updating it in accordance with the contractual requirements. So, I mean, really, that tells us everything we need to know. It is paramount that the program is updated by the contractor to avoid passing that level of control over to the project manager. And it's vital in our experience that administrative activities like keeping the program up to date are done contemporaneously, as there's really no catch-up provision within NEC, and the contractor has the upper hand, the employer has the upper hand if the contractor falls behind with this administration, because they will lose entitlement to compensation events. An accepted program is a useful project management monitoring tool, and it is a fair basis for the contractual mechanisms like compensation events to operate. So it obviously sounds, we're saying a lot there about keeping having an accepted program and keeping up to date. And I suppose we just simply can't stress enough how important it is to do that, and how often really we see that as being the reason for a particular dispute. Now, at this point, I should mention acceleration. Acceleration has got a very specific meaning in NEC contracts, which is bringing completion or a key date forward. It is different and much narrower than in other standard forms. Now, acceleration under NEC does not mean accelerating or speeding up to ensure that a completion date or key date is achieved. If a contractor is falling behind on a program because of the contractor's own issues, then they might suffer LDs, liquidated damages. If the contractor is falling behind a program because of the employer or contractor issues, they might get a compensation event that pushes time out. However, there is no acceleration under the NEC contracts as defined under NEC in either of those situations. Rather, if the employer wants the contractor to complete earlier than the completion or key date, either the original date or as it's been pushed out by a compensation event, the only way that can be done is if the contractor is asked to accelerate. The completion date will then be the completion date as amended, as brought forward. And it's important to note that, because if the completion date has been pushed outwards, first of all, by a compensation event, particularly in a power project, for example, where there's a fixed deadline, that is an issue because the whole project is about a particularly fixed date when perhaps the power has to come online. And a contractor can come under pressure to still hit that original completion date. However, under NEC, unamended at least, there is no requirement for that to occur. And so acceleration is then when the employer needs to hit a particular earlier date, either because of their own delays have pushed the date out, or because they just want to finish earlier or by a particular fixed date. So the two are handled very separately. You work out the time effect of a compensation event, and then separately you can be asked to provide a quotation for acceleration. In either of those circumstances, for whatever reason, if an employer wants to bring a completion date or a key date forward, whether that has been pushed out by compensation events or not, they can ask for an acceleration quotation, and that is where the contractor tells the employer what the impact is of that acceleration in terms of both time and cost. In the unamended NEC contract, at least, the project manager cannot force acceleration, even if, and this is quite important, even if the contractor is in delay. So even if it is a delay caused by the contractor, and therefore the contractor is not going to complete at the completion date, but is going to complete later than it, the contractor does not have to accelerate, and in fact the contractor doesn't even have to provide an acceleration quotation. the contractor is in complete control over what the cost and time impact of any such acceleration would be, and they would set those out in their quotation. So, as I'm saying, it is important to recognise that acceleration is something entirely different to other time-related events, and not something that contractors can be forced into. However, of course, as a contractor, you must be aware that if you are in delay, and if you are going to complete later than the completion date, you might be liable for liquidated damages if you don't meet the date that you ought to. When NEC contracts are amended and moved away from the NEC principles, there are times when acceleration can be forced on the contractor. And I would flag this. This is an area that's often amended. In those circumstances, perhaps a better way of thinking about acceleration is as a compensation event, where the contractor is essentially being told to do something. And although it might actually be an amended acceleration clause, it's actually not, or it actually doesn't operate that way. It is certainly different to what NEC unamended envisages acceleration to be, and can just be turned into a compensation event. So that's in circumstances where the acceleration provisions are amended such that the contractor has to provide a quotation, or even such that has to simply accelerate when told to, and will get compensated for it. And that's why we say recognising what your contract looks like and whether acceleration is at the contractor's option or not is quite important. And if you're a contractor, do not accelerate until the quotations that you've submitted have been accepted, or say no if you do not have the resources or do not have the ability to accelerate at all, and particularly say no if it is other issues that are causing the delay. If a contractor accelerates before the quotation has been given, and if there are other delaying events, that is really a recipe for those issues becoming intertwined and becoming very difficult to unravel. So we are now at our first pause point, and if you are listening to this in a group or even individually and would like to consider and discuss some of these programme aspects in the context of some questions, then when we move to the following slide, please pause the webinar for this discussion. The next slide has on it some questions to prompt discussion, but we would also encourage you simply to discuss some of your own experiences of programme issues, how your company operates programmes, what tips you can share with each other to make the programme aspects of the contract run more smoothly. And we're conscious of this already. We've covered a lot of ground. Now, if you haven't done so already, we would encourage you during this workshop simply to pick up, flick through and read the NEC contract as you consider some of the questions in the workshop session and some of the aspects that we've just talked about. And perhaps, if this has been a lot to cover in the first half hour of this, do feel free to go back through some of these slides or some of the provisions in the contract and talk about them, think about them. Do they make sense after what we've just been talking about? Okay, if you have completed your workshop and are ready to move on, we're now going to go on and look at early warnings and notifications.
Under Clause 16 of NEC contracts, parties have to notify each other as soon as they become aware of any matter which could increase the total of the prices, delay completion, delay meeting a key date, or impair the performance of the contract works in use. The important thing to note in this clause is the use of the word could. So the contractor or the subcontractor has to notify even if it is not clear that there will be an increase in price or if there will be a delay. It is if there is a risk of it happening that they need to notify. When giving an early warning, the contractor does not need to be specific as to which compensation event clause might apply and should not. It is the warning that is important, not how they were going to be compensated or to make a claim for it later. And linking the warning to a specific compensation event can cause issues later, if, for example, the incorrect compensation event has been used. It should also be noted that Clause 16 applies to both parties. This means that if an issue arises that the employer knows about and that could cause an issue for the contractor, the employer should notify the contractor in the same way. Early warnings are an important project management tool embodying the philosophy of early identification and resolution of programmes, and are a key contractual mechanism. This sets the NEC contracts apart from other standard form contracts, as the contractor simply cannot bottle up claims until the end of the project. Equally, the employer cannot just leave the contractor to sort out claims that they have become aware of. Both parties must notify each other of issues as and when those issues occur or are foreseen. In addition, the contractor may give early warning of anything which could increase the total cost of the contract. Early warnings and the risk register are used so that the project team can plan accordingly and mitigate the risk where possible. This is not required if the issue has previously been notified as a compensation event. Either party can then call a risk reduction meeting to seek solutions, to decide on actions, and to decide if any risks can be avoided or passed, and then can revise the risk register. It is common practice for such a meeting to be called after an early warning notice has been issued. However, the meetings can also be held periodically to assess the status of ongoing risks on the risk register. Solutions are also sought to bring advantage to all those who will be affected, and the mutual trust and cooperation philosophy of the contract comes into its own here, as all parties should work together to the advantage of the project. The primary idea is to cooperate at an early stage and to resolve issues before they become problematic for the project or to escalate into disputes. However, it should be noted that there is no consequence on the employer for failing to submit an early warning. For the contractor, if later in the contract a compensation event arises due to an issue which the contractor should have notified to the employer using the early warning procedure, then it will have a financial impact on how you assess that compensation event, because the compensation event is then assessed as if you had made that early warning. The flip of that is not true on the employer. If the employer does not give the contractor an early warning, it does not change how compensation events are dealt with. And so in that specific example, you would just have to look at that delaying event and seek a compensation event reflecting the fact that the employer was late in telling you. You would know at that point that there would be a bigger impact because they were late in telling you about it, so the detriment would be opposite. Under clause 63.5, compensation events are assessed as if an experienced contractor had given an early warning notice. So there can be consequences if early warnings are not given, which would have given the opportunity to mitigate any risk. This is a fair and reasonable approach, which is sensible. In terms of risk generally within NEC, at its base, all risks sit with the contractor, other than those that are compensation events which are contracted for. Educated suppliers understand and can work up detailed risk registers, so they understand risks exist and can manage them. The idea is that regardless of whose risks they are, they consider what they might be and put some prices against them so that everyone has a more realistic approach to how the project is going to turn out. You do not add on a sum for every risk that you're going to come across, but should take a weighted approach to it. Now that you can build that sum in, but on target costs, it is easier to do that where no one would win or lose by that. If the risks do not come to pass and none of the money has been spent, there is a bit of a gain share for the contractor, but it also allows for it to have been priced and managed. Whereas on a straight activity schedule, a lot of the time that is written out, because otherwise it would come and sit with the contractor, as it would give the contractor a pot of money that they can then spend, and most employers will be happy that these risks have been identified. Generally, the risk register is not a contract document, which should be borne in mind. However, the advantage of having one is that you can always think about any unknown unknowns and flag any risk. A risk register means that you will still have a list of things to keep your eye out for, which might crop up during the contract and allow you to deal with them appropriately.
Under NEC, the scope for compensation events is much wider than in other contracts, reflecting the overall approach of NEC, which should be collaborative and a fair allocation of risk. This is, of course, subject to amendment, and sometimes the scope for claims can be reduced and become much narrower. As mentioned earlier, as an overriding principle, the contractor bears all risks other than those covered by compensation events. This is an area where, as operators at the outset of the contracts, you should look and consider what amendments have been made to the contract and which, if any, compensation events have been cut out. If you have any doubts about these, speak to perhaps a commercial director or legal team who've prepared the contract to clarify how this leaves the risk in the contract and what this will practically mean on the ground as the project moves forward. Although NEC is written in simple language, it is full of difficulties, and one of those is the removal of compensation events. Compensation events cover all unexpected events and risks, including changes or variations. Changes to the works information, for example, are a classic compensation event, whereas in other contracts variations are dealt with separately. A variation or change is a compensation event under NEC. We would encourage contract operators to take care when looking at what the most appropriate compensation event is to notify. Is it that the project manager has changed works information? Is it that the project manager has not made an instruction or done something else? And try not to lump all events under the simplest compensation event, as that can open it up to challenge. Compensation events under NEC also deal with both time and money. And again, that's distinct and different from other contracts, where time and money are usually dealt with separately. Where you have a compensation event which might fall under several categories, there is a risk that the notification will fail if it's notified under the wrong clause. In this situation, we recommend that you list the compensation event clauses which might apply. There's no difficulty in doing that, because when you notify a compensation event, you are notifying the issue and risk that's occurred. If that issue happens to be covered by two compensation events, then that's fine. But the assessment of that compensation event is the same regardless of which clause applies. As a contractor, you're actually asking for assessment of the risk and the issue that's occurred, rather than looking for the particular compensation event that you've notified. Now, as I mentioned at the start, and as with administration of the contract more generally, record keeping is essential to compensation event assessment. You have got to record the compensation event themselves, as well as the early warnings. Because it is so useful to define costs across all the various options to make your adjustments to the prices, it is important to have good records of what these changed circumstances have actually cost you, what the reality is on the ground, because you might have to rely on them if there's not an agreed compensation event early on. Now, on compensation events, the other key aspect to be aware of is time bar. There is a set time limit under NEC within which you must apply for compensation events after a contractor becomes aware of them. Contractors should be aware that this is one of the most heavily amended areas of the NEC contracts. Under the standard form, the contractor has 8 weeks to notify a compensation event after the event has arisen, but this is usually amended to 3 or 4 weeks, or sometimes even less. And this is very important to note, because the time bar is a technical knockout for compensation events. However, time bar operates not to the penalty of the contractor, so where the contractor ought to have notified and didn't, if you didn't notify because you didn't know of an event, it's not operated in a draconian way, and it only operates from when the contractor knew or ought to have known about the compensation event. The contractor ought to give an early warning as soon as the contractor thinks something could have an impact. But a contractor doesn't have to do a compensation event until there's actually been an impact. So the key there is that you give your early warning as soon as you think something might have an impact, whereas a compensation event doesn't arise and you don't have to notify it until there has actually been an impact. In terms of the mechanics of applying for compensation events, first of all, the contractor starts with the notification. Notification for a compensation event, as I've said, is entirely separate from an early warning notice. A specific and separate compensation event notification is necessary, and that is a precondition for recovery of time or money compensation. If it arises from the employer giving an instruction or changing a decision, the employer really should notify the contractor of the compensation event at the time of giving that instruction or instructing the contractor to submit quotations, unless the compensation event is the fault of the contractor or if quotes have already been provided. The contractor then puts the instruction or change decision into effect. The employer may ask the contractor to submit quotes for a proposed instruction where the contractor has not yet put the work into effect. Now, as to compensation events which do not arise from a project manager's instruction or change of decision, the contractor notifies the employer of the event which has happened or is expected to happen as a compensation event, and the employer has not notified the event to the contractor. Now, at that point, after discussing with the contractor different ways of dealing with the compensation event, the employer might ask for alternative quotations, and the quotations would comprise of both changes or proposed changes to the prices and any change or delay to the completion date or key dates. If the compensation event alters the program, this should also be included in a quotation. Now, in those circumstances, the contractor has got to submit his quotation within 3 weeks of being asked, although again, that's the unamended version of NEC, and that time period can often be amended. The employer will then reply within 2 weeks, either requesting the submission of a revised quote, or accepting the quote, or a notice that no instruction or change is going to happen. If the employer seeks a revised quotation, they need to explain the reasons why, what's got to change in that quotation. If the employer doesn't reply to a quotation on time, the contractor can notify the employer of this. If there is still no reply from the employer within 2 weeks, then unless the compensation event is for a proposed instruction, the contractor's initial notification is treated as an acceptance of their quotation. In assessing compensation events, compensation can be by way of both money or time. As I mentioned earlier, they're both included in a compensation event, if relevant. For monetary compensation, as we mentioned at the start, this is based on the defined costs as set out in the schedule or shorter schedule of cost components plus the addition of the fee. It is possible under clause 63.13, if both the contractor and project manager agree, for the event to be assessed using the activity schedule. Now, in our experience, that really is only done for particularly straightforward events. The defined costs are different from the agreed tender prices. This, as I mentioned earlier, reflects the NEC approach of reimbursing the contractor on a cost-plus basis for the monetary consequences of events which are not its fault. The calculated change to the defined costs plus the associated fee is then added to the prices. It is intended that the quotation assessment process is done prospectively, either ideally prior to an instructed change or prior to an event fully materializing. In that case, the defined cost is an estimate of work to be done. Where work has already occurred, the assessment is of the defined cost of the works actually undertaken. If a compensation event reduces the total defined cost for the works, then the prices can be reduced, but this is in limited circumstances only. As we noted previously, accurate assessment of compensation events can only happen if the contract data is complete with respect to the shorter schedule or schedule of cost components. Now, we mentioned the heads of claim that can be made under the schedule: people, equipment, plant and materials, charges, manufacture and fabrication, design and insurance. Now, only the specified components of cost within those heads can be recovered in a compensation event. Items obviously cannot be double counted across the different heads, and only those heads that apply to any particular compensation event in question will be relevant and used. People only includes those within the working areas and not any head office costs, because off-site overheads and profit are intended to be included in the fee percentage addition. and that is quite a common misunderstanding. The contractor's contract data part 2 allows for the definition of the working area to be added, so as to include, for example, off-site working or storage areas or off-site accommodation areas. If head office personnel or locations are added to this definition, as can sometimes happen, this can cause confusion as really it will duplicate parts of the fee percentage element which is applied on top of the compensation assessment. Recovery for equipment in a compensation event is usually calculated by reference to a predetermined published list of equipment rates, again as set out in the contract data. And it only includes the labour cost if that published rate also includes such a cost. An example might be a tower crane, as the published rate for tower cranes would normally include a licensed operator and so would be an all-in rate. The charges section for a compensation event is also a source of some confusion, as it is applied as a percentage uplift on the people rates according to a predetermined percentage set out in advance in the contractor's contract data. This uplift can cover lots of things, such as welfare facilities and surveying costs, but it is important that there is no double counting, as anything within that uplift cannot also be separately claimed within the equipment head of claim. It can be seen from this discussion in this section that it is vital that the contractor completes the relevant sections of its contract data at tender stage. Defined cost is used to value compensation events, and the shorter schedule of cost components defines what categories of cost can or cannot be claimed. For the time impact of a compensation event, it's assessed against the latest accepted program by reference to changes to the completion date or to any specified key dates. It is in this case that an up-to-date accepted program is really important for a contractor. The project manager is unlikely to accept a quotation for additional time if the accepted program is not up to date. The project manager will, in that event, probably either make his own assessment of the time impact, or if the accepted program is up to date, then the contractor is more likely to keep the float in any assessment, as the compensated time will reflect the contractor's planned completion of the works or individual key dates. Clause 63.5 sets out the impact of early warning notices on the assessment of compensation events. If an early warning notice was not given timeously, then the project manager will alert the contractor to this in the event of a compensation event being notified. And when it comes to the assessment of that event, the project manager assesses the compensation event as if the early warning notice had been given. This is likely to reduce the compensation, the monetary compensation due to the contractor, and perhaps the time compensation, because the project manager can assume that all appropriate mitigation and early solutions to deal with that event were put in place and compensate the contractor on that basis. So the contractor can be penalised in terms of the compensation outcome for not submitting an early warning notice. And we reiterate that the absence of a timely early warning notice does not preclude the contractor's recovery of compensation, whereas the absence of a timely compensation event notice does. The absence of a timely early warning notice, as we've said, really just changes the calculation. Clause 65.1 intends that a compensation event is not implemented until a quotation is accepted or the project manager notifies his assessment. However, in practice, implementation often happens concurrently with or even before the assessment. In our experience, contrary to the position intended by the drafters, compensation events are frequently assessed on a retrospective basis because, for example, the contractor needs to progress the additional instructed work without delay rather than wait for the notification, quotation and assessment process to be implemented before doing so. That situation really is not specifically catered for in the NEC conditions. However, in our experience, that has not prevented parties applying the compensation event process in those circumstances. So, after that, we are now at our second pause point, and again, If you would like to consider and discuss some of these compensation event aspects in the context of some questions and with reference to a copy of the NEC contract, then when we move to the following slide, please pause the webinar for this discussion, or as last time, we've covered a lot of ground there, so if you simply want to pause and look at the early warning and compensation event provisions in the contract, just to try and make sense of everything that we've been saying, then please pause the webinar now. Okay, if you have completed your second workshop and are ready to move on again, we are now nearly at the end of this webinar. We are now going to move to look at the conclusions from today's webinar and what we have learned.
So we have discussed many different issues and best practice guidelines in our webinar today, and we have summarised a few of these on the slide. We talked about the activity schedule and noted that this needs to be as detailed as possible and needs to be linked to the programme. These two things will really help with your contract. Some projects may benefit from having early discussions to set some of the expectations and establish a few points early on. Who is the project manager? How independent are they going to be? What is the process that people are going to follow for programmes and compensation events? Are defined costs going to be used, and what is our escalation or adjudication approach? We discussed programmes, and clearly the most important thing is to have one. Keep programmes up to date, notwithstanding any resourcing issues, and consider how to manage these issues if they do make this quite difficult. Operators should know what reasons are valid for rejecting a programme and what reasons are invalid. If the programme is being rejected for inappropriate reasons, tell the other side, put it in writing and keep it on record, but keep submitting your programmes as you go along. The key thing with compensation events is to use defined cost where you can, even if there is some resistance from the other side. Do them contemporaneously. The quicker you are in dealing with these things, the less of a programme they become. It is much more difficult to leave the assessment or consideration of compensation events until later, particularly if they involve time. Finally, please remember the importance of saying no or otherwise forcing the contractual position. Do not be afraid of notifying the employer that they've rejected your programme for an invalid reason, or tell the other side when they are doing something wrong. Say no if you're being asked to accelerate and you've been given a quotation, or if it's not been agreed yet. And do not put yourself in a position where you cannot adhere to the obligations which you did not need to agree to.
So we are at the end. We do hope that you have enjoyed our webinar today. Hopefully you've been able to use it perhaps to have some discussions in the workshop pauses. Perhaps you've had time to digest it as you've gone along. We hope you've had the chance to look at the contract as well, because we're aware that we've covered a lot of ground there. We're aware that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the key aspects that contract operators have to deal with. And we think it is best, if you haven't done so already, now to simply open a contract, look at the provisions and start to think about what they mean, and perhaps go back through some of these slides or through some of this webinar if that would be helpful. And as we said at the start, please, if you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss any topic in more detail, or perhaps if there's anything that we can help you with, if you think that you do have a particular problem or would like to talk to us about any aspect at all, please feel free to drop either myself or Lisa an email or give us a call using the contact details which are on this slide. All that remains is for us to say thank you very much for listening to our webinar.